Well, good morning again and welcome to our series in Daniel. Welcome to our Christ Baptist Church members and others who are just tuning in to our series of the study of the book of Daniel. Now we find ourselves in chapter 5, which I think is perhaps one of the most interesting chapters in the Bible. And you'll find there's actually a scene here in this story of Daniel that actually influences our current culture, and we'll be able to point that out to you. And we're finding ourselves now in Daniel chapter 5, where Daniel has been taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar from chapter 1 back to Babylon with his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we've seen how they have gone through several trials and shown the sovereignty of God to King Nebuchadnezzar. It gave a prophecy actually of God giving a picture of what's going to be happening to the end times in Daniel chapter 2 with the statue. We covered that. And last week in Daniel chapter 4, what we saw is a testimony by King Nebuchadnezzar, who really understood personally about God's sovereignty, who applied it directly to his life as he was humbled and became walking around like an animal on all four, his two arms and his legs. He was walking around and eating grass. And he learned that he's not so sovereign after all as a king, and that God is actually the one who gave him the kingdom. And after he recognized that God is sovereign over all, God gave him his kingdom back and restored it back to him. And we saw that last week, and I said that's going to feature here in Daniel chapter 5 as an important fact to know, that that's a historical fact that happened. But now we find ourselves in Daniel chapter 5. Again, a historical account. There's really no real major prophecy in this, although Daniel does give a prophecy about specifically the king. It's a very near-term prophecy, which you're going to see. And it really, this section here ties very neatly with chapter 4 and chapter 6, which we're going to get to again tomorrow when we deal with Daniel and the lion's den in chapter 6. But here we are, Daniel chapter 5, which again you're going to find is the most fascinating account. Follow along with us as we go through this. It's again another fairly long chapter. It's about about 31 verses, but action-packed and riveting is this account. All right, let's just get on with let's just dive right in here. Verse 1, chapter 5. Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. Stop there for a second. This is really important right here. Stop to make some notes in your Bible. Notice the word Belshazzar there. This is not Belteshazzar, which is the name of Daniel in Babylon. This is not Daniel. This is Belshazzar. Notice the next two words, the king. Belshazzar, the king. This is the king. Nebuchadnezzar is no longer the king. Belshazzar, a man named Belshazzar, is the king. And it's going to be very important who this man is. And I'm going to point this out just in a moment. But Belshazzar right now is the king. And he held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles. So he's drinking wine with 1,000 people. Can you imagine a party for 1,000 people? That's what he's got in his hall there. Now, what do we know about Belshazzar? He's not just the son of Nebuchadnezzar. He is actually the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. We've now gone 2 generations from chapter 4 to chapter 5. Belshazzar is not the son. He's the grandson. And we know this because historically, the Babylonians were in a big fight with the Medes and the Persians. And the battle was ongoing. It was taking some time. And Babylon was a city. Now you got to get this. Babylon was a city that was 25 kilometers square, meaning it was 25 kilometers on each side. That's how long the walls were around the city. Each wall was approximately 20 to 30 meters tall, buried 7 meters deep in the ground. The width of the walls were so wide you could run 4 chariots abreast in a race across the walls. So it's about as wide as our is our major city streets that go 4 lanes. That's the thickness of the wall. It went about 20 to 30 meters tall, and it was buried deep in the ground. And then they had inner walls as well in there. So this is a pretty well-protected city that no one was able to attack. Well, there was a battle going on outside with the Medes and the Persians, just outside the walls. This battle was raging and fighting. And what's interesting is the man who was actually fighting for the Babylonians outside was a general by the name of Nabonidus. Who is Nabonidus? Well, he's the general of the army, but you know who he was? He was Belshazzar's father. He was Belshazzar's father, who was actually Nebuchadnezzar's son. That's why Belshazzar was the grandson. And Belshazzar was king over the city of Babylon, but he wasn't king over the whole Babylonian Empire. Nabonidus was king over the whole empire. That's why he was fighting the battle outside. But his son, Belshazzar, decided to have a feast to say, look how great we are in the temple. That's what's going on right there in that first verse. So Belshazzar's having a feast while his father is outside fighting this bitter enemy, the Medes and the Persians, who are coming right at their throats. Now, when Belshazzar, verse 2 says, tasted the wine, he starts getting cocky, and he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple and brought from Jerusalem and stuck them in his storage there. And he said, bring out the specific Jewish gold and silver items that came out of the temple at Jerusalem. Interesting that he would pick Jewish objects that were taken out when his father's fighting the Medes and the Persians outside. He just wanted to feel very proud right now. And so he brings these out, and they bring them out. Verse 4 says, they drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So they praised these wooden and stone idols while they're drinking profusely, 1,000 people, out of the specific vessels that came out of the temple at Jerusalem. Notice in verse 5 the word suddenly right there. Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Can you imagine that? All of a sudden, a large hand shows up. And you see the hand, but there's no arm, just a hand. And the hand has a writing instrument and is writing on the wall there. Suddenly, that happened while they're drinking. Surely they were thinking they were just seeing things for drinking, but they were all seeing exactly the same thing. Verse 6, then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. This is the most amazing description right here. This whole verse is taken just to have us look and see what Belshazzar was actually doing. His face grew pale because his thoughts about this hand were bothering him. His hip joints went slack and his knees began to knock together. Do you ever remember as a kid when you're watching in cartoons, whenever one of the cartoon characters would ever get scared, what would they begin to do? Their knees would begin to knock together. We always remember that as children watching. When somebody got scared and they saw a ghost or a skeleton or something like that, all of a sudden the knees start coming together. Where do you think that came from? It came from Daniel chapter 5. So even the cartoons of the 20th century that were put together having all this got their idea of fear from Daniel chapter 5 when the king's knees began knocking together. Can you believe that? That is just so amazing right here. That God's word right here, Daniel chapter 5, would have such an impact in culture several thousand years later. Well, as we move, we see the king then in verse 7. He yelled to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. You know what a Chaldean is? A Chaldean is a master astrologer. So he brought in the astrologers, the magicians, whoever could give whatever magic they could to give an understanding of this. He said, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me should be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck, have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? To Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 4. Can somebody please interpret for me these words? That's really what's at stake here, isn't it? God sends his word, Daniel chapter 2, through a dream. God sends his word, Daniel chapter 4, through a dream. God sends his word through a handwriting on the wall, Daniel chapter 5. And every time, the natural man cannot understand the word. I hear the words, I see them written down, I have no idea what they mean. This is why Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, he says, who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the spirit of the man which is in him? He says, even so the thoughts of God no one knows except the Spirit of God. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 11. No one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. But what we see from Daniel, going back to Daniel, what is he known as? The Spirit of the Holy God is in you. That's what he was known for. Nebuchadnezzar said, we know a spirit of the holy gods is in you. And every time God presented his word, but the natural man couldn't understand the word. They didn't understand the dream, didn't understand the dream in chapter 4, didn't understand these words on the wall right here. Nobody could understand them, not the best magicians, nobody. But Daniel is a man who's about ready to understand this. So he says, I want whoever can interpret these words will be clothed in purple, that means you're rich, have a necklace of gold around your neck, and have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Now the question is, why would he say the third ruler of the kingdom? Why not the top? Well, he couldn't make him higher than Belshazzar. In the same way that Pharaoh couldn't make Joseph higher than Pharaoh. But why the third? Well, because Belshazzar was not the number one. Who's number one? Nabonidus, his dad. Who's number two? Belshazzar, who's in there drinking wine. So then who would be number three? That would be the one who interprets this message. And that's why he offered him. The highest thing he could ever offer was number three, because he was only number two. And so we see that right there in verse 7. So all the king's wise men came in, verse 8. They couldn't understand it. So chapter 9, King Belshazzar now is very alarmed. His face grew even paler, and everybody's now depressed. Everybody's upset. So now we have chaos. Chaos in the party. Chaos of 1,000 people drinking wine. This hand wrote this message. It's now written on the wall that everybody can see. Nobody can understand. Well, now we get to the next scene. Verse 10. Enter the queen. Well, the queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the kings and the nobles. And the queen spoke and said, O king, live forever. Don't let your thought alarm you or your face be pale. By the way, this is not the queen, meaning the wife of Nabonidus. This is the queen mother, who would be most probably a wife associated with Nebuchadnezzar. Somebody closely there. Why? Well, because she wasn't in the banquet hall. Notice verse 10. She entered the banquet hall. She wasn't there. She didn't want to participate in her grandson's nonsense, drinking wine from all the vessels that came out of Jerusalem. She knew that was really messing with fire. She had no part of that. But now she comes in because she hears there's panic, and she tells the king, O king, live forever. Don't let your thoughts alarm you. Verse 11, there is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. There it is, right there. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 11. There's a man in whom there's a spirit of the holy gods. Someone who understands God, someone who has the Spirit of God in them that can understand what God is saying. And in the days of your father, see, if she was Belshazzar's wife, she wouldn't understand about the days of your father. In the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, now remember, in Hebrew, the word father is the same for father, grandfather, and so forth, just like the word for son is the same for son, grandson, great-grandson, and so forth. There's only one word in Hebrew for father or in future, and there's only one word for sons that go back as well. So King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, your grandfather, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. And again, we say that Nebuchadnezzar is his grandfather because we know Nabonidus is the actual son of Nebuchadnezzar who's fighting outside. And we have this from archaeological evidence that tracked that Nabonidus was actually fighting this war that was outside. So the grandmother comes in and says, the king actually appointed Daniel chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas or riddles, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation, which means Daniel was not there. He had to be summoned. Well, if he's not summoned, if he's not there and he's summoned, where is he? Well, verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king. So he spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who's one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Notice that? Or are you this Daniel who's one of the slaves? You see, under Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel was pretty much number 2 in the kingdom. But once the son got in charge, then the grandson got in charge, Daniel found himself in the slaves' quarters. You know what this shows us? This shows us that when you stand before God and you get to be put in a difficult place, you can expect that you might have times of great prominence. You might have people listening to your word, and then you might find yourself thrust down to the bottom of the barrel. Daniel found that he was number 2 in the kingdom, and then he was down at the bottom. And not only that, if he's now dealing with Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, and the dating of Daniel chapter 5, I'm going to show you at the end of this chapter, is in Daniel's last days. Daniel is approximately 80 years old right now. He's almost 80 years old coming in as a slave when he was number 2 in the kingdom. And Belshazzar could care less about him. Are you that slave that came out of Judah? Verse 14, now I've heard about you, that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, extraordinary wisdom have found in you. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar, my grandfather's wife, my grandmother told me about you. Said, you're a pretty sharp fellow. But you're still a slave. Remember, I'm the king. In verse 15, just now, the wise men and all the people I brought in, I wanted to read this inscription and make the interpretation known, but they couldn't do it. But somehow, my grandmother thinks you've got something that is able to help me. I personally have heard about you. I personally heard about you. I think he knew a lot more about Daniel than he wanted to admit here. He had to have been raised with Daniel being number 2 in the kingdom. I've heard about you. You're able to give interpretation, solve difficult problems. But you've never been in my agenda. You've never looked to help me politically. But if you're able to read the inscription, make its interpretation known, I'll clothe you in purple and give you a necklace of gold, and you'll be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. Notice verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself or give your rewards to someone else. But I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. Notice what he says there. Here's another lesson to learn right here. He could have said, you know what? I'm not helping you at all. I really respected your grandfather. You've dishonored him. You've shamed him. I am not going to help you in your political aspirations. He could have done that. But see, Daniel doesn't care about Babylon. He doesn't care about Belshazzar or Belteshazzar, Belshazzar and his kingdom. He doesn't care about that. He cares about truth. His job is to get God's message to the people. That's his job. So he said, you know what? Keep your rewards. I don't want them. I'm not doing this for what you're going to give me. I reject all prosperity. I reject all promotions. This is a man who knew promotion. He was also very, very high up. He said, keep it for yourself, but I will give you truth. I will give you what God has said for you, because that is what it's about. It's about me serving the Lord, not serving you. I serve the Lord to give you what you need. So it begins, starting in verse 18. O king, the most high God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. And he goes on and explains everything that Daniel chapter 4 talked about. He says in 19 and 20 and 21, it says he had great sovereignty, men of every language feared him and trembled before him. Whoever he wished he killed, whoever he wished he spared alive. Verse 20, but when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, his glory taken away from him. See, he's describing the dream and what happened in Daniel chapter 4. He was driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts. He was given grass to eat like cattle, his body drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, that he sets it over it whom he wishes. See, your grandfather was given great sovereignty by God. He conquered everybody, but he became proud, and God took it from him and made him walk like a beast. Now, here's what's interesting. Verse 22. Yet you, his son, meaning his grandson, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew this. Daniel is now so bold as not just to say, I'm going to tell you God's truth. He says, I'm going to tell you something about yourself, Belshazzar. This is what your grandfather did. It happened to him. I was there. I gave him the dream and the interpretation, and you knew all about it. Yet what did you do with it? You threw it aside. What did you do with me, who was the advisor that was involved in all that? You put me in the slaves' quarters for your own political ambitions. Even though you knew all this, which means you are worse than Nebuchadnezzar, because you did this with all the knowledge that happened to him. Verse 23, but you've exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. You brought the vessels of his house before you. And then you and your nobles, your wives, everybody started drinking out of them and praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Notice what he says this, which do not see, hear, or understand. I'm telling you what a fool you are. You're drinking wine and praising objects of stone, wood, and iron. And you knew what happened to your grandfather. But the God in whose hand are your life breath and all your ways you have not glorified. All your life and everything is in God's hands. Same thing happened to his grandfather, but now it's even worse because he knew it and did it anyway. Then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out. Now this is the inscription that was written out. And we see these words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Those are actually Aramaic words. And I just want to explain something to you. How is it that Daniel understood these words? Well, I'll try to make it simple for you. When we think of words in English like the word bore, like where we get borehole, where you drill a hole and you bore a hole, you drill a hole, so where we get borehole, so the word bore, B-O-R-E. But if we change the vowels a little bit and go to B-O-A-R, bore, well, that's a pig. A boar is a kind of a pig. And if I even want to go B-O-O-R, I can say, oh, you're boring. I'm bored. I don't want to bore you. I don't want to tire you out. You see, when we change the vowels, we change the meaning of the word. The same thing is true in Hebrew. Only the difference in Hebrew is they didn't actually write the vowels. People just knew what they were, so you only had letters like on a license plate. So in this case, the E's would be gone in Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And when you don't have the vowels, you put the wrong vowels in. Can you imagine if the word bore, but all you had was B and an R, B-R? Well, if you chose O and E, like borehole, you would be thinking I'm going to drill a hole. But if you think B-O-A-R, you're going to think a pig. But all you see is B-R on the wall. Well, it's the same thing with here, with Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And so the magicians all chose the wrong vowels, and they were thinking, oh, it means nonsense. I don't understand it. It's something to do with money and who knows what. Daniel could see that no, they're reading this wrong, and you put in the right vowels. And he says, this is the inscription, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation, meaning God has numbered your kingdom, put it to an end. It's mentioned twice to show that God has really numbered it. Mene, Mene. It means God has weighed. The actual term in Hebrew is weighed, not numbered. So God has weighed you out. He's weighed your days. He's put it on a scale and he's weighed it. Tekel. You've been weighed on the scales and found deficient. You see, that's why it goes to weigh. Mene is the idea of a weight. And we see that. It's an idea of weighing. And it's like 10 kilograms. A mina. Tekel means to be found light. The actual Hebrew verb, it means to be not quite measuring up. So he says, you've been weighed on the scales and found deficient, found light. You're light. And Paris, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Paris. It's actually the same words as we get Persians. P-R-S. Paris. Persian. The word Persia means divided. See, it's this. It's the same as the man in Genesis 11. There was a man named Paris. In his days, the earth was divided. So, you've been weighed, you've been found light, therefore you're divided by the Persians. That's what the message means. So Daniel explained it very clearly. Here it is. Then Belshazzar gave orders, true to his word, and they clothed Daniel with purple, put a necklace of gold around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him. Now he's the authority of third highest in the kingdom. He did it without even blinking, without even batting an eye. He just said, here it is. You've been weighed, you've been found light, and now your kingdom is going to be divided by the Medes and the Persians. He said, okay, here's the material I was going to give you. Meanwhile, the Persians are fighting outside. And then we look at verses 30 and 31. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. That's a prophecy that Daniel gave right there. He gave the prophecy in verses 25 to 29, which are actually 25 to 28 gave the prophecy, and then verses 30 and 31 it was fulfilled. He was killed, and Darius the Mede took over. How is it that the Medes could all of a sudden conquer a city that had walls 20 to 30 meters tall, probably 15 meters wide, 7 meters deep in the ground? This is how history records it. The Euphrates River went underneath the walls of the Babylonian walls into the city. While they were having a drunken party, the Medes and the Persians went and dammed up the river, causing a backflow in, and the water went down below the walls of the Babylonian Empire, and they all came in like ants underneath. And they all just flooded the city that night, found the king, killed him. And so now Darius the Mede takes over when he's about 62 years of age. So we see here a changing of the guard. Daniel, for close to 70 years, not quite 70 years, but close to 70 years, he was in Babylon. And that's where the people were, under the Babylonian kingdom. Now, he's still in Babylon, but now there's a new king, the Medes and the Persians. The year is about 537 BC. So he's been there now, we say 68 years he's been in that city, and he just saw a massive takeover. Because the Medes and the Persians took over, all because of the foolish activities of the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, who watched his grandfather have these visions and dreams and answered by Daniel, saw his grandfather for a year, or actually for 7 years, acted like an animal and then came right again. He saw all of that, saw Daniel promoted. What did it mean to him? Absolutely nothing. This shows that outside of the Spirit of God, we can do nothing. Outside of the Spirit of God, we cannot believe. Outside of the Spirit of God, we can't see that it's God's hand, that it's actually real, and that I can fight sin. Outside of the Spirit of God, I cannot fight sin. I cannot fight my rejection of God outside of His Spirit. This is why it is so critical we understand. We need God's Spirit. We need to be born again. We need to confess our sins and say, Lord, give me that Spirit of Christ who died for me so that I can have my eyes open to see the living God. It's only then that we can actually see and understand God's Word. It's only then that we can actually see what sin really is and who God really is and His goodness. Daniel had a Spirit of the living God in him. Belshazzar, he saw all of this. It meant nothing to him. So much so that he went and got the vessels to drink out of them. So much so that he is the example of every cartoon that's made in the 20th century of knocking his knees. That's what God did to him and made such a fool out of him for the next thousands of years. So this is the lesson we see out of Daniel chapter 5. Linking Daniel chapter 4 of Nebuchadnezzar's dream back right here into this, only it made a fool of his grandson, who did not believe, didn't understand. Daniel, at 80 years old, kept persevering, gave truth where it was needed, stated boldly that truth, told the king about who he was, and was able to give a prophecy that led to the king's death. He had no fear about what was going to happen. And then we see a changing of the guard. And now we're going to see tomorrow what that means in terms of the changing of the guard. In Daniel chapter 6, in one of the most familiar stories of all the Bible, Daniel and the lion's den. We're going to see that tomorrow. Thank you for being with us in this Daniel chapter 5. It's been an exciting time. Thank you.